All right. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's funny how everyone turns into a student when they're in the audience, and it's hard to get unruly audiences to calm down, but this is great. Welcome. Welcome to Africa, 60 Years of Independence, the official grand opening of Africa 2020, the year full of Africa-related activities, as the posters say everywhere. My name is David Eeraert, and together with Maaike Westra and Ton Dietz, we coordinate the Leiden African Studies Assembly, which is the network of Africanists that is behind today and all of the other activities for the year. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you all here for this day. What are we doing here today? 1 year and about 30 days ago, 60 years and 1 month ago was the actual phrase I had to use there. The year of Africa began where 70% of the African population at the time was living under colonial rule. Only 1 year later, this number had reduced to about 32. Their numbers had inverted. So 68% of the population at the end of 1960 was independent. And this remarkable fact, this quite astonishing development, was the starting point for us to organize this Africa 2020 year, and it's the departure point for us for today to start thinking about what has been the harvest, what have these decades of independence, or more or less than 60 for different countries, yielded. And you all have received a thematic map, including this map, that shows a lot of the facts of these 60 years. That shows, for example, that the population of the continent has increased from 250 million to 1.3 billion, that urbanization has increased from around 20% to around 50% today. Democracy is now everywhere, at least nominally, and quite recently, in particular, there's been robust economic growth. We all know these facts. And these are all reasonably optimistic facts, they seem. What today is about is not necessarily these facts, but it's to get one layer deeper. It's to dig a little deeper about what has happened and how we need to understand these 60 years and the harvest that this has brought. In particular, we will look at the impacts of the fallist challenges to the way we understand Africa and African studies. We will look at the way that religion might help us to understand different forms of society and engagement with Africa. We will look at the really complicated challenge of doing justice to all the voices that together make up the complexity of African history. And we'll try to make sense of some of the political reforms and the political upheavals that have happened, particularly in recent years. All of this we will do with the help of great experts that we've invited to speak. And it'll be a very rich and long program, as you will see. So this, as you also have the program in front of you, the setup will be reasonably straightforward. We'll have speakers for about 45 minutes each, and then followed by discussants on the right-hand side of about 15 minutes, and then for each session we'll have 30 minutes of question and answer sessions to help you to try to make sense of what they're trying to say. As I said, it's a rich, complex program. These questions are not easy, so actually this will be, it seems like a very passive program where you'll have to sit and listen for hours. I actually would encourage you to make this a very active activity where you sit and try to digest everything that's being told to you, and actually try to put it in the context of this bigger question of what have these decades of independence, of post-colonial independence of Africa brought us. Final bit of housekeeping, we're reasonably punctual, we're only 5 minutes late now. Let's try to be punctual along the day because we have a lot to get through. Now, with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza, who is the holder of the A.C. Jordan Chair in African Studies at the University of Cape Town, as well as the National Research Foundation Chair in Land Reform. Professor Ntsebeza has written on all kinds of themes very well, and eloquently on land rights, democratization, rural local government, traditional authorities, and he's just told me that because he no longer has to go to boring meetings, he now will have even more time to write and talk about these things. So we look forward to everything that you will still produce on this. And to our great pride, next week on Friday, he will receive an honorary doctorate from this university. So, without further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
I should time myself. I'm given 45 minutes, and it's now going for quarter to 10, quarter to 11 in South Africa. Good morning. Thanks to the organizers of this event, and I remember the last time I was here in Leiden, I was invited by Tom, and at the time he was doing work on Africa Works, and that was 2014, and I lost my luggage, and throughout the workshop, I only had one pair of trousers and one shirt. And the rest I got from a friend of mine, Harry Wells. So these are my memories of the Netherlands. And I'm happy now to be back here to receive this honor, and with my luggage this time. Now, I've been asked to talk about African studies in Africa. And this is, most people won't know me for doing work in African studies. My work, as you have heard now, is on land questions, land and agrarian questions in Africa. But since 2012, I was appointed the director of the Center for African Studies in Cape Town. And as a director of Center for African Studies, I had to learn something about African studies. So it's not my field of expertise if you compare this to my work on the land question. When I was asked to talk about African studies in Africa, I immediately thought about the significance of what I call the fallist moment, and which has its roots in developments that took place in Cape Town. And for me, the events that took place then and led to most of us at the University of Cape Town and elsewhere to reflect about African studies now. I want to argue that the issues raised by students, although not clearly articulated, as could be expected, presented academics, that is us, students themselves, and intellectuals outside the academy with research questions about how Africa and its people have been and must and should be understood. These are, of course, not new questions, but questions that have been sidelined and ignored, largely as a result of heavy repression in most parts of the African continent, soon after the dawn of independence in the late 1950s and early 1960s, as well as the effects of the structural adjustment programs imposed by the Bretton Woods institutions. This historical background will form the context within which African studies in the current period will be presented. I will wrap up my presentation by reflecting on opportunities and prospects for African studies within the continent, as well as challenges. I start now by reflecting on what I and some of us call the fallist moment. And what I refer to as the fallist moment can be traced to the entry of university-based students into the political life of South Africa. This manifested itself in the Open on 9 March 2015, when a University of Cape Town student activist flung poo into the imposing statue of the arch-imperialist and capitalist Cecil John Rhodes, which was mounted on UCT grounds. Soon thereafter, students who organized themselves under the banner Rhodes Must Fall movement demanded the removal of the statue. They alleged that the statue signified deep-rooted links between UCT and colonialism, or in the words of UCT Emeritus Associate Professor David Cooper, colonial capitalism. Within a month, the statue was removed, making this a significant victory for the student-led effort. By this time, students had added more demands, notably the decolonization of the curriculum. They were opposed to what they loosely referred to as Eurocentrism, and were in favor of what they expressed as Afrocentric approaches to teaching and research. Of major significance was students and academics at a number of universities in South Africa, as well as elite American and British universities such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cambridge, and Oxford. These universities had pledged support for this campaign. This clearly demonstrated that the protest was the proverbial spark that started the prairie fire, highlighting, as it did, the urgency of problematizing the African colonial past, not merely as a national issue, but as a continental and global phenomenon. It soon became clear to some of us that whilst this was a period of great excitement, offering opportunities for institutions of higher education in South Africa and elsewhere to interrogate their past as they considered their future options, there was an urgent need to stand back, to reflect and harness the energies into a sustained intellectual project that would bring clarity and critical analysis to the student demands, most of which were expressed in the form of slogans. This is a call similar to the one Archie Mafeje, who worked here in the Netherlands and became, if I'm not mistaken, a Dutch citizen. Archie Mafeje, this is a question similar to a question that he posed back in 1978 when he was reflecting on the Soweto, the impact of the Soweto uprisings of 1976. For him, militant action and simple slogans, important as they were, are no substitute for a program of action whose task it is to come up with clear, informed, and well-justified demands and policies. Worth noting is that the issues and questions raised by the students were not new. Part of what I want to do in this address is to highlight critical moments of this history up to the eruption of the 2015 student-led campaign. So briefly, about the historical content, I'll just mention mainly points and not elaborate too much on them. I use as a point of departure Archie Mafeje, sadly marginalized in the world of scholarship. I'm currently doing research on his intellectual and political history. He raised, amongst others, two critical points that are still pertinent to current debates. First, according to him, colonial historiography purported to show that before colonial intrusion, the indigenous people neither had a history, culture, nor modes of social existence in the continent. This view of a people without a past of their own was reinforced by anthropologists whose point of departure was that Africa was a continent of tribes. This colonial way of viewing Africa and its people was blind to what recent research, largely based on archaeological excavations, is adducing, namely that the indigenous people could have lived in various parts of the continent for thousands of years, and that those living on the African continent have always been heterogeneous with levels of development of their own social formations. Mafeje did his fieldwork for his doctoral research on the kingdoms of Uganda and used his experience with kingdoms and empires to make his point about social formations in Africa. Samir Amin makes a similar point as Mafeje about the heterogeneous nature of African societies prior to and at the point of colonial plunder. This colonial way of thinking emerged quite formidably in Britain and Europe and spread from there. It was to be joined by America, where the study of Africa falls under area studies, also coming out as a study of the other. These notions, centering as they did on the study and understanding of the native, in quotes, were challenged as early as the turn of the 20th century, not by Africans based on the continent, but descendants of slaves who traced their roots in Africa. It is this movement that would influence a large number of Africans who studied in England, in Europe, and America, and ended up playing leading roles in the struggle for independence in their countries. I have in mind here people like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, which at the time was called the Gold Coast, Julius Nyerere, Tanzania, at the time called Tanganyika, and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. These were some of these leaders. At independence, these leaders saw universities as spaces where the study of Africa and its people could be rethought and rewritten. I have in mind here the speech, the famous, well, in my book, the famous speech of Kwame Nkrumah when he was launching the Institute of African Studies in Ghana. I think it was around 1962, I think it was 62, where he talked very powerfully about the importance of African studies. In fact, he regarded African studies as the key focus for universities. And it's interesting to reflect that at this point in time, African studies in Africa, including my universities, is marginalized. The relationship between political leaders and intellectuals proved to be of short duration. The honeymoon was over by the mid-1960s, barely a decade after independence of the first African country, which was Ghana in 1957. Tandika, Kandawire, Achi Mafeje, and Mahmoud Mamdane covered this repressive moment in Africa, which led to a serious brain drain. The introduction of structural adjustment in Africa, spearheaded by the Bretton Woods institutions, affected research in many African universities. Mamdane's book is arguably the most devastating account. My own experience of the state of African university derives from efforts we made to set up an association of African studies in Africa The acronym is ASA, A-S-A-A, which goes back to 2012 when I occupied the A.C. Jordan Chair in African Studies at the University of South Africa. To my surprise, and this was the first time now I focused on African studies on the continent, and to my surprise, I discovered that there were in 2012 about 5 active centers or institutes of African studies that were based on the continent. 2 in South Africa, Cape Town and Free State, 1 in Ghana, in Nigeria, and Morocco. The association was formally launched, that's the Association of African Studies in Africa. It was formally launched in Ghana in 2013, and I was elected its inaugural president. Since then, the association has held conferences in Ibadan, Nigeria, in 2015, Ghana 2017, and last year the conference was in Kenya. It is commendable that the association has managed to sustain their biennial conferences, but the going is not easy, to say the least. I can elaborate on that if people are interested. My other experience is UCT, where the idea of studying Africa and its people was on the spotlight in the late second half of the 1990s, when Mahmoud Mamdane was director of the Center for African Studies at UCT. I think now I've become the next director after Mahmoud. and that position now has its own. I can write, I can read a paper just now on that. Archie Mafeje, in fact, was one of the first applicants for that position, and he was not even interviewed. And this is a person that was appointed by UCT in 1968 as senior lecturer in social anthropology. But that's another story. It's another seminar. It is no exaggeration to say that on the evening of the eruption of the student-led campaign at the beginning of 2015, the study of Africa and its people was not on the agenda. And it was largely business as usual in many universities on the continent. The only exception here would be Codestria. But Codestria is not a university-based institute. It's an independent institute. And they are the ones who kept the flag of Africa high. With the eruption of the student-led protests following the events of 7 March 2015 at UCT, with its criticism that the curricula was deeply compromised and colonial, the study of Africa and its people was put squarely on the agenda. Missing, I argue, was the clarification of the slogans that were deployed by the students. They deployed slogans like Eurocentrism, Afrocentrism, Decolonization, and so on. So there was lack of clarification of that on the one hand, and an articulation of an agenda for the study of Africa and its people in the aftermath of what has become known as the Fallist movement. Then I look at African studies in the aftermath of this moment. Am I still doing well? Okay. In the first instance, any serious attempt to formulate a new agenda for African studies must anchor itself in the history of African studies to date. In other words, the new must emerge from, to quote Karl Marx, if it's still fashionable not to quote Karl Marx, it must emerge from the womb of the old in all its formulations, Eurocentric or otherwise. This is the approach I observe that Archie Mafege adopted. Applying for an advertised post for the A.C. Jordan Chair in African Studies in 1993, Archie Mafege's key motivation was that he had vast international academic and research experience, that he was aware of, and that he was aware of the limits of the South African white academic and intellectual establishment. He reasoned that the system of apartheid in South Africa in particular underdeveloped the educational landscape both philosophically and socially. While at first glance, it could be assumed that this would only affect black intellectuals and scholars, Mafege argued that whites who use social sciences as tools of degrading or oppressing the other could not have avoided underdeveloping themselves. I think this is an important point. For Mafege, one of the departure points would be to demystify white social science with the intent not only to liberate young black academics from unjustified intellectual domination by white intellectuals, but also to discern more clearly the intellectual distortions and perversions of the past. According to him, this would give the young black intellectuals a good starting point for deconstructing knowledge developed by white scholars, paving waves of generating new research protocols and more liberating forms of generating knowledge. This would entail a systematic review of North-dominated scholarship as a critical step to any serious decolonization effort, leading to rewriting the history of Africa and its people. This initiative, according to Mafege, would throw into relief processes of social integration and the development of common citizenship rather than otherness, and evolving more inclusive semantic categories rather than the invention of tribes and perpetuation of ethnic identities. It's an important point, especially for us in South Africa, who are constantly now being exposed to legislation by our democratic government which reinforces tribalism. It is this that scholars such as Mafege have in mind when they refer to an African or Afrocentric approach to knowledge. It is an approach that should give greater intellectual content to the meaning of Africanity and to cause for what some people know, sometimes sloganize as African Renaissance. Mafege was forever against slogans and sloganeering, and consistently argued and campaigned for scholarship that is backed up by serious social, historical, ethnographic research, relying on authentic African cosmologies and social concepts such as Ubuntu. He uses this term. I thought he wouldn't use it because of the way in which the term is abused these days, but he thinks it's a significant concept. Because he says that these are concepts that should not be allowed to be buried under the debris of Eurocentric transpositions. It is not surprising that scholars such as Mafege and Samir Amin championed pluralism. This is Mafege in particular, and a multipolar world as an antidote to imperialist impulses which impose a unipolar model on the rest of the world. For African studies, this would entail a desire to define the field and subject of African studies as a decolonial one in which Africans, particularly those based on the continent, define and redefine the intellectual project for themselves. It is on this basis, and this basis alone, that collaborations and relations with Africanists outside the African continent can be forged on the basis of equality, mutual respect, and fairness. Is this a plea to avoid dealing with contentious and tough issues? Not at all. Nothing should be kept or swept under the carpet, pretending that there are no problems. It should be at the core of any serious intellectual and scholarly endeavor to confront and deal with these problems. Nothing should be taken for granted, and all assumptions and arguments should be scrutinized and rethought. No one should be excluded from the debates and discussions, but there must be ground rules, and these entail dealing with ideas, not the people expressing them. We should learn to listen and engage with arguments and demonstrate preparedness to present counter-arguments of our own. What are the challenges? I go back to Mafeje, who, in my humble opinion, has given a great deal of thought to these matters. The central theme of his booklet, published in 1992, and the title of the booklet is In Search of an Alternative. It's published by SAPES, and it was based now in Harare, and at the time was under the leadership of Ibo Mandaza. Now, the central theme of this booklet is the quest for an African identity in the world of scholarship. What he refers to as, and I quote, the search for a lost identity and the attempt to affirm an inner self. At the time, Mafeje had concluded that a true community of African scholarship had not been achieved, largely as a result of three fronts on which intellectuals and their organizations had to struggle. The first of these are the adverse effects on intellectual life arising out of the melee of the post-colonial state in Africa, something that I referred to above, bannings, imprisonment of intellectuals. At last started taking place in the mid-late 60s. And the second one is the role of donors. Fetchenau spent a considerable lot of time, not only in this in 1992, but when he was at the University of Namibia, setting up an institute there, also reflected on the role of donors. And for him, the donors invariably political and ideological in their motivation, and hostile to, or at best suspicious of independent-minded African scholars, and often accuse them of ideological bias. According to Mafeje, African scholars are dependent for their research on donations from the North. They are caught in a serious dilemma. Their pride is hurt, and the realization of the power of veto of the North is hard to swallow, leading to bitter arguments among African scholars themselves. The third point that Mafeje highlights is the attitude of intellectuals in the Northern Hemisphere. Not all intellectuals, but a significant number of them, who continue to rationalize their own desire to control and dominate by imputing that most of the research proposals by African radicals in particular or non-conformists are unscientific or below standard. This forces Mafeja to ask the question that, given the fact that in such cases, the criteria for judgment are themselves in dispute, rationally, who is to say? For Mafeja, the issue is not scientific. It has to do with racial superordination and subordination in an age of imperialism. After his experiences at the University of Namibia, and having failed in his bid to get his job at the University of Cape Town in the 90s, and I say his job because Mafeja was offered a job on merit as a senior lecturer in 1968 at UCT. He should have claimed his job back because no, he was not given this job because UCT hid under apartheid rule. Apartheid ideology and rule. So in the 90s, he should have been given that job, but he applied. And this time he was not even interviewed. So after these experiences, with both happened in the early 90s, Mafeja had little confidence that historical white institutions would transform themselves for as long as the white intellectual establishment, those are these words, held sway in terms of knowledge production. They would not, according to him, be willing to allow themselves to be objects of the implicit African intellectual revolution. They were othering others, and Mafeja says they must be put on the spotlight and be the other. And he says that for as long as they have control, they wouldn't allow that. They, if the intellectuals, some Mafeja saw things, avoided any serious self-criticism and would not allow anybody to criticize them. He himself tried in Namibia and ended up being frustrated. And instead of going back home to South Africa, he went north to Cairo. So he had a version of Cape to Cairo. And this time, instead of going to the Cape, he thought the Cape was up north. So that's how much, the extent to which he was frustrated. Mafeja came back to South Africa in 2001. And those of us who encountered him there will agree that he went to South Africa to die. Yeah, he was finished. But he did not see, when he came back, he did not see any prospects of reviving and reinforcing reinforcing black colors due to limited material. And this was his reasoning. His reasoning was that if he came back to South Africa, it would be better for him to go to historically black universities. But no, his reasoning was that no, this was not going to be possible because he saw that no, those institutions were themselves marginalized by our democratic government. He ended up taking a position at the National Research Foundation and their African Research Institution. But given the structure of university life in South Africa, Mafeja had to be attached to an institution. And he was attached to the University of South Africa. And once attached to the University of South Africa, he had to abide by the rules of the University of South Africa. And I think that frustrated him. And I'm not a doctor or something, but I think it speeded up the process that led to his death. He was very frustrated. I have chosen Mafeje's experience for illustration purposes, to illustrate the kinds of challenges confronting African studies in Africa. There are opportunities, but there are challenges. And discussions like this should look at both the opportunities and the challenges. I thank you.
Thank you. Can I invite you to sit on one of the chairs?
Okay, thank you.
And so the structure will now be that the lecturers will move that way, then we invite the discussants will then join them, and then you can ask them questions. That'll be the structure of the day. So our discussant, thank you very much, Prof. Ntsebeza. Our discussant now, Dietz, is no doubt known to all of you as the previous director of the African Studies Centre and as professor of the study of African development at Leiden. He has also studied too many things to mention, from rural development and now a lot of focus on migration. And he is now officially retired, although still happily, I hope, and luckily for me, my co-chair in the Leiden AASA network. And in my experience, and I don't know if we'll see that today, he is also infectiously optimistic about the state of the African continent. So, Dietz.
Good morning. Before I start, for those of you who don't know, Archie Mafeje used to be professor at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the late 1960s. Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza and I know each other from meetings during European conferences on African studies, meetings in Leiden, and meetings in Cape Town. And I remember how devastated and shocked Lungisile was when a photo exposition that he had helped organize in Cape Town about the Roads Must Fall movement was hijacked and violated by LGBT activists who felt ignored by that movement. You remember. I also heard him speak with horror about the destruction that took place during some of the violent encounters on campus, when also a famous painting by an anti-apartheid activist was attacked because it was mistakenly regarded as an icon of oppression by activists who had no idea about its background and meaning. The same had happened to precious old law books when rioting students in UKZN in 2016 had set fire to the University Law Library in Durban, while both at the Mafeking campus of Northwest University and at the University of Johannesburg, fire was used by campaigning students to erase the symbols of a hated system, even if these were computer rooms, auditoriums, science rooms, and study rooms. And in a lot of press reports about the activists in 2016, the violence and the use of fire was strongly condemned and even compared with Nazi terror in the 1930s. Radical demands are often uneasy bedfellows with brutal violence, and sophisticated intellectual and philosophical foundations can easily be overshadowed by very crude and, I would say, counterproductive forms of destruction. This is not something that only happened in South Africa as part of the Fall movement, or the Fallist movement, as you call it. It is part of a worldwide history of contestation. And the sad truth seems to be that often those in power are more afraid of violence and anarchy than of the power of words and ideas. Panicking rulers either respond with counter-violence or they give in and make room for new ways of doing things. For us as intellectuals who are also interested in the impact of radical demands, this link between ideas and violence is an uneasy one. The same is true for another element in the radical demands of the decolonisation movements in academia, both in South Africa and elsewhere, and most visibly in the UK, the USA, and in Ghana, as you mentioned. That element is what I call upside-down racism. The Z-Press book that has just been published about the fall movement in Oxford talks about the struggle to decolonize the racist heart of empire, but a lot of the language in that book is steeped in racial terms. Authors talk about black bodies that are out of place in higher education, and about institutionalized whiteness. Slogans are being discussed such as, "Why is my curriculum white?" Or, "Why isn't my professor black?" And for me, a disturbing discussion happened in Ghana, where the fall movement was translated in an anti-Gandhi movement. There, the statue of Gandhi had to fall, because he was portrayed as a pro-Indo-Aryan and anti-black activist, in the words of the Ghanaian activists. And although it's an obviously a fact of life in many social environments, in many places on earth, including here, that something that is called racial microaggression exists and can be very oppressive. Putting everything under the umbrella of race is easily becoming racism itself. Currently, a lot of the debate is about intersectionality. Lack of access, open and hidden forms of exclusion and discrimination are often a combination of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, age, and so on. Focusing on race may be historically understandable from a South African perspective. Real decolonization and emancipation must go beyond race. I personally welcomed the fall movement in South Africa after my experience as part of the staff of SANPAD, the South Africa-Netherlands Program of Alternatives in Development. And after many discussions with African and other PhD students in the Dutch research school, CERES. Already in the 1990s, I asked these PhD students to do positionality studies of the most important books and scientific articles they had used during their studies. And I continued by asking them to do the same for the scientific papers they had written themselves or were in the process of writing. Positionality studies are meant to do a systematic analysis of the authors used in bibliographies and of the publishing houses or journals where these people had published their work. For many of these students who were doing research in and about Africa, it came as a shock to discover how few of these cited authors were actually born and raised in Africa, how few papers had been published in Africa itself, and how a lot of the knowledge that was referred to was in fact based on foundations in the UK, Canada, Australia, and often very much the United States of America, and sometimes a bit on France and the Netherlands. Language also obviously was an issue. In UK and USA-based scholarly work, even on African countries where English is not the official language, bibliographies often only or mainly contain English language publications, let alone publications in local languages. The other way around, French language work about often French-speaking African countries very often mainly uses French language sources and predominantly written by authors living and working in France. Many scholars from Europe who call themselves Africanists, like myself, have one area on the continent which they regard as their reference area, and very often it's the area where they have been doing their PhD research. For me, that is West Pokot in northwest Kenya. I am in the process of systematically studying everything that has ever been written about that area and to see who in those publications is referring to whom. And I can tell you the results are already shocking. Among more than 1,000 publications so far, hardly any publication was written by someone from the area. It is very much about the Pokot and the area of where the Pokot live, and not by or with the Pokot. In the course of 120 years of written knowledge production about this area, you can clearly see waves of authors with certain national backgrounds and waves of topics which often do say more about spikes of attention or hypes in the UK, the USA, Japan, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and currently also Kenya outside the area. But often those do not have much to do with what happens or is important or regarded as important in the area itself. And with the exception of a few classics, the network of reference is often very much restricted to people in the same national scholarly tribe, if I may use the word after your words, and often with a myopic attention for their own academic discipline. My attempts to develop participatory forms of knowledge development and local assessments of development and change started in this area in the early 2000s, and it became very obvious to me that local people, and especially the poor ones, were very surprised that they were being seen very often for the first time in their lives as co-researchers, and not only as subjects of research, or in exceptional cases only as language interpreters. For me, that became the basis for developing the so-called PADEV research method in Ghana and Burkina Faso. It became obvious there and elsewhere that global and national hierarchies in knowledge production and knowledge dissemination very much dominated the curriculums of universities, and in fact the whole university, the whole knowledge system from primary schools upwards. Decolonizing knowledge production and making universities more inclusive is a massive challenge, as it also challenges many other hierarchies as well, and the ones based on class, nationality, and gender stereotypes and forms of exclusion may be even more important than the ones based on the color of one's skin. Big steps are needed, but small steps are important as well. For instance, the library of the African Studies Centre in Leiden, for many years, has had as its standard practice to acquire at least half of its books and journals from Africa, also by systematically visiting African book fairs and buying books and journals there. In Leiden, we encourage our students to make use of that local material and to be aware of the biases in their literature lists and make additional compensating choices. We encourage our staff to co-publish with researchers based in Africa. We invite visiting fellows from Africa, and we do so since a long time. And we started appointing staff coming from Africa, encouraging them to connect these worlds of knowledge. With our country portal, we try to connect to a great number of sources of information about all African countries, and with a special emphasis on sources from Africa itself. And we invite people with a diaspora background, also from beyond the academic community, to engage in our seminars and country meetings. But we know it takes more to tackle the deep-seated, structural forms of institutionalized bias and exclusion. And like many institutions in which one is enveloped, one is often deaf and blind for how they structure and focus your attention and how they form your biases and opinions. One often needs a shock to realize the cocoon one is in, and the fall movement was that type of shock for many in South Africa and beyond, also here in Leiden. Let me end with three things. You all received, or will receive, our new thematic map, Africa at 60. The title alone shows an external gaze. Of course, Africa is much older than 60. And that external gaze and its title was a deliberate provocation, if I may say so. We see it as legitimate that there are African studies centers in Europe. And of course, they have that external gaze. We should not shy away from that. It's true. We are institutes studying Africa, hopefully with Africa, partly by Africans, but we are not an African institute based in Africa. Of course not. The second, please have a look at the website africaknows.eu about our conference in December 2020, Africa Knows with an exclamation mark, which uses as its motto, "It's time to decolonize minds." So it's very much in line with what we have been discussing just now. And third, we are so proud that Leiden University will honor Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza as Doctor Honoris Causa next week at the Dietz ceremony, Friday. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you both for such evocative and provocative introductions, I think, to this theme. We thought we'd start the day nice and easy with the theme of decolonizing the academy and racism in the academy. So yeah, the floor is open. Professor Ntsebeza, would you like to start by responding to Dietz, and then you can think about questions. Let this sit for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a loud voice, but I tend to warm up as I talk. Well, there isn't much. I mean, no, I would like now to say at this point about Tom's response. I think the point I would like us to pick up for discussion is the issue of Africans based on the continent and Africans in the diaspora and what is commonly called Africans. That is Europeans who study Africa and so on. That to me seems to be an issue that arises after the Fallist movement. And the questions there seem to be who should study Africa. And one way of interpreting what happened over the last 5 years is that there are those who believe that Africans should study themselves. And that whoever studies Africa, especially people who are not based on the continent, is doing an illegitimate activity. I mean, that's one way, when you listen to the slogans, not articulations, the slogans that sort of came up in the last 5 years. So that's one issue. And in that regard, I'm reminded of a conference that we held in Port Elizabeth in 2017, and my colleague Caroline Hamilton was there, and we ended up with a publication asking the question, whose history counts? Right. I'm raising this because I have a particular view, which I hope emerged out of my presentation, and that view is that knowledge is knowledge. Everybody should be allowed to engage in any field. What is important is that we must observe certain rules. And those rules are the rules of engagement. That we listen to each other. We don't look at who is saying what, whether you like that person or not. You look at the argument. So many ways, if you to recall a slogan of one of the movements in South Africa, the non-European Unity movement, their slogan was something like, we fight ideas with ideas, right? So that's the view that I hold here. And I think, clarifying those issues, the role of insiders, outsiders, is important. The other point I want to raise here, rising out of my work and what my friend Ton sort of presented, is this whole sort of debate around area studies. When I became director of the Center for African Studies, I was accused of promoting area studies, and then I started to do research on what people mean about area studies and so on. And I think there is something about that term when you say you study a certain area, particularly in the era of globalization and in the post-dictatorship period in Africa, where many Africans find themselves outside the African continent and are not based in there. So if you want to know Africans, is it a good approach for you to go to Africa and study Africans there when a significant number of Africans are not residing on the continent again? So I think this is something that you must think through. We must also think about the relationship between area studies and what is called global studies. Because, Africa cannot be viewed in isolation. Africa is part of a system. And it is in studying Africa as part of the world that I think we should focus on. I think those are the two issues that I'm grappling with. This is not really my field. If one talks in terms of the number of years one has spent on a topic. I've spent decades now doing research on the land question, on chiefs and so on. And compared to that, this area, African studies and so on, is a new area, going back to the early 2012. Right.
Thank you. Are there questions? So we have two people walking around. Let's start in the back. Let's move forward. Yeah, so we have one question over there. Yeah. Let's collect three, and then we'll give them to you, and you can pick and choose what you want to answer.
Good morning. My name is Ferdi. I've worked with refugees from Africa. I have an alternative question to you, dear Professor Lungisile. What brief, positive, motivating advice can you give to former asylum seekers or refugee students from former war zones in Africa and who live now in the Netherlands?
Come again, what's the question? But the question?
Yeah, the question is, what brief, positive, motivating advice can you give to former asylum seekers or refugee students from former war zones in Africa?
So the advice
question,
that you can give
but
to
it's a big question.
students.
But
advice?
Yeah.
I can give?
Yes.
To refugees?
There you go. That's
Okay.
As you think, we'll collect two more. Yeah, there's that's an easy one, all the way in the back, and then, yes.
My name is Henk van de Heuvel, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I have an open and honest question about the decolonizing the curriculum debate. I find it very, very interesting. But my question is, how prominent is this debate in countries all over Africa? Because I have come across this debate mainly in South Africa, in academia in South Africa, very rightfully so, by the way. But I'm also very much engaged in higher education in Ethiopia, for instance. I've never come across with this debate. The debate on the curriculum in Ethiopia is quite different. It's about development, how to be relevant as a university in its particular environment, and how to make sure that graduates will find employment, which is also a very, very relevant question.
Thank you, and maybe one more. There was one here. Oh, yeah, first.
Professor Monser Bekai, Director of the African Studies Laboratory at Algiers University. I would like to ask a question, and I have also a remark. You evocated during your presentation many African studies centers, such as or like Cape Town or Cape Town Center, yeah, Morocco. But I think that you forget one of the most important centers, which is situated in Egypt. And it was initiated by President Jamal Abdel Nasser in the 50s. The problem is that the main production in that center is in the Arabic language. So this leads to ask my question. Do you think that the African Union can play an essential role in promoting African studies in the continent? Second question. Do you think that,
What is the first?
I repeat, do you think that the African Union,
Union.
African Union, yeah,
Yes.
ex-OUA, organization, yeah, can play an essential role in promoting African studies in Africa? Second, do you think that good governance is a remedy for the problem of African studies in the continent? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Let's turn to both speakers. You can take them in turns. I'll leave it up to you.
Okay. The first question was a difficult question not to ask of an academic. and if you want to get confused, you must ask in advance from an academic. Because no, it won't be a clear-cut one. Refugees who are here, what advice can I give them? Well, the advice I can give refugees are here is that they must try and understand themselves, where they position themselves as Africans outside the continent of their birth in an era of globalization. I mean, it sounds like an academic issue not to pursue, but I think it's important. It's important in the sense that, this globalization as we know it, particularly today, and it has a longer history than the last 30 years or so ago, is creating a situation where we should go back to debates like a world citizen, where we create a world of human beings, where human beings interact more with nature and see how they can establish a good relationship with nature than fighting amongst themselves and killing themselves and using science not to invent drones that are going to kill people who are not even aware that something fine up there is going to destroy them. And innocent people around them. So I think this is one response, a major response, especially in a forum like this that I can make. That's the advice, that there are refugees here, but the name refugee shouldn't exist. One should look at a situation where so many years from now, we'll be talking about human beings, irrespective of where they come from, and not these divisions that were in fact imposed on us in order to facilitate rule by a minority, whether local or global. And the other question I noted here is decolonizing the curriculum, the rest of the African continent, universities in Africa, and the impact of structural adjustment. Sure. Where is that? Can that question be repeated? I can't even read my own notes.
Where this debate really takes place? Is it only South Africa, or is it?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, yeah. Well, no, this debate, this debate. This is an international debate, because if the way we frame the question is about Africa, we're referring to a geographic space. But if we refer to Africa and its people, then the idea of geography doesn't make sense. Because Africans are all over the place, just as Europeans are all over the place, right? And Europeans, of course, and British and so on, went to Africa and plundered historically. And Africans are victims of that, and they are forced. They don't have the same power as colonialists have on African. So once again, it goes back to the idea of African studies that I'm grappling with, African studies and global studies. It looks as if one way of looking at African studies is African studies in debate with global studies. And Africa is part of the globe. And this is how we should understand it. And then, the issue of language is important. It's important, there is a lot that we do not know. And I feel that as an African who comes from an English-speaking background, because we are colonized by the Dutch and the English, so I speak English and a variant of Dutch called Afrikaans. And we don't know, I don't know much about the French-speaking world. There's a bit that's emerging, but the Arabic world seems not to be a different world. So I think there is a need for us to unite Africa. In fact, there is a debate as to whether the Arabic world is part of Africa, or whether when we talk about Africa, we talk about Black Africa. Those are discussions, these are debates that we should welcome in the academic space. We shouldn't be prescriptive. We should try and understand the reasoning, the thinking behind these debates, and see what contribution we can make in elucidating these issues, rather than be part of the problem. I think that's dangerous for academics to do that. We should always sort of rise about these everyday issues, and be analytical, and then give back to the world what comes out of our analytical research.
Let me add a few experiences from how we dealt with the issues of the three questions. At the African Studies Centre, we always invite people from the diaspora, not only from the academic diaspora, but much broader. And that is very enriching and also sometimes very problematic. And the issues are that you deal with people who are sometimes extremely traumatized. So in debates and in engaging them, you have to notice that trauma and acknowledge it. You also, if you invite people from a certain situation of contestation internally, and you invite country meetings, for instance, people to country meetings, you immediately have all the political clashes that exist in that community, and sometimes those clashes can be really violent also in our classrooms, and we really would like to avoid that, and it's an issue. The second question, on where does this debate on decolonizing the academy really take place? Of course, South Africa is obviously clear. That's where it started, and it has ripple effects very much in the UK and the USA, and it has ripple effects also in the Netherlands. I noticed that within Africa, the ripple effects are very clear in Ghana. They are clear in a different way in Morocco. As many of you will know, Leiden has a Morocco Institute, and part of the debate there is if you take Morocco as just an area and take it as area studies, that is not the way you should do it. You should take Morocco as an in-between between Europe and Africa. And when I had the privilege of speaking to that institute, there was a big debate already. And it's a few years ago, about decolonization, about language, about access to knowledge by various people. And that is a much more important thing to tackle, I think, than just talking about area studies as such. That brings me to the third question. Area studies nowadays are really different from area studies 20 years ago, I think. I think many of the current area studies, that's the same for European studies, it's the same for Asian studies, the same for African studies, no longer look at areas and its people in seclusion, as if it's just there and only there. At the African Studies Centre, we started a whole program called Africa in the World. And we really invited many scholars to think about these relationships between other places in the world and their relationship with Africa. So we even have publications about Indonesia and Africa, about the role of Egypt in the rest of Africa. Those types of issues are there. And that's important. So it's nonsensical to see area studies as the study of a particular area and just leave it at that. It should be beyond. Yeah. Now, finally, the role of the African Union can be important, but I think it's more adequate to ask what role do existing organizations of academics in Africa play, Pan-African institutions, like the AAU, the Association of African Universities, and like the African Academy of Sciences. And when I was involved in those organizations, it struck me that those organizations try to be quite well organized in the hard sciences, particularly the African Academy of Sciences. And they do very good work there. But they really shy away, it seems, from these issues in the humanities and the social sciences because of its controversies. And we have to bring that back. I think it's a very genuine question. How can Pan-African organizations really stimulate this type of debate and do so in a genuine way, not too much politically or ideologically influenced, just as open questions.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick round. Okay, Ingrid was first, and then...
Good morning. My name is Ingrid Samset. I'm with Leiden University. Thanks for very inspiring talks. You, Lungisile, if I may, refer to the work by Mafeje and his sort of conclusion that his experience was about racial super and subordination. And Ton picked up on that, acknowledging that race matters, but arguing that emancipation is not only about race, and we shouldn't put everything under the umbrella of race. So that, for me, raises a concern. I am white, so if we as white people say that we should not reduce decolonization to race, do we not risk to silence the debate about race? As I see it, there are racial disparities in the world of knowledge production. These disparities are systematic and they have colonial roots. As white people, we benefit from these hierarchies. We should recognize that. So my question is, how can we, as specifically positioned individuals, have a respectful and meaningful debate about how African studies can be de-racialized? Thank you.
Ooh, tough one. Peter? Yeah. Sorry, I'm seeing all kinds of hands. I'm just doing the ones that I saw first. And then
Peter Pels, Anthropology at the University of Leiden. I had to think so strongly during Lungisile's talk about the African History Department at the University of Dar es Salaam in the 1960s. The reason is that it's not taken up in a history of African studies, right? Because it was history in the first place, but it was also very strongly African history. And all those brilliant scholars, right? Izaria Kimambo, Abdul Sharif, John Iliff, Terence Ranger, and I can continue with another 10 names, and they're equally famous. All those wonderful scholars established a way of looking at the world with a focus on Africa that was, I think, revolutionary in the discipline of history. Except that it was for a long time, it wasn't recognized. And my personal experience, when I was in Tanzania myself as a PhD student, was that it was slowly destroyed, not least by structural adjustment. Right. So there is that global involvement again of measures that weren't thought of in Dar es Salaam, but yet that were executed in Dar es Salaam to such an extent that something that was clearly of an intellectual revolutionary nature was slowly denuded of its life in a way. And I had to think of it so strongly that, because this has nothing to do with Africa, and not even by the provocation of using Africa as, you know, the external gaze on Africa it has much more to do with these structural global relationships. And the important thing, I think, partly about this discussion, and I very much agree with the previous question, what strikes me then is that the people who put that structural global relationship on the agenda for the first time were people from the African diaspora, and in particular people like Antenor Fermin from Haiti and William Du Bois from the United States. So I wonder what if you take that background, which clearly is still with us today, right? You can want real decolonization to rise above race, but indeed that it is still there in that structural form. And I wonder what you would think about the role of African studies centers in Europe as well as in Africa in that longue durée of historical destruction, in fact.
One more over there.
Hello, my name is Marijn Prakke and I'm a research master student from Utrecht from studies which is now called the History and Philosophy of Science, but actually is opening more and more in the history of knowledge production. And I'm very interested in African knowledge, but what frustrates me very much in the research of it, that it seems almost impossible to find this knowledge without a clear ideological bias. So it's either this very colonial stance, or it's very like an activist stance, or it is well, it seems really hard to divide, to circumvent this ideological base in just trying to find out the knowledge itself in a way. And I think part of that is because the African knowledge traditions are at least partly oral traditions. And so going further, how do we deal with that? That's, I think.
Yeah. So I have one really urgent question from Mike on that side. So.
Thank you very much. My name is Chibui Kuche, African Studies Centre. Two short questions. First one to Professor Lungisile. Ton told us that you were shocked when the LGBT people took over your event in South Africa. And I was just wondering, why were you shocked? And then the second question is but the most challenging part of your presentation had to do with the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And since it took place in a university, I'm just wondering, and to you and to Ton, if that was a university senate and you were to vote, how will you vote? And can you explain why you vote that way? Thanks.
Okay, so
if the second one has to do with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, if it happened, since it happened in a university and the Senate or the council had to decide whether it should had to fall or not, and you were part of that event, how will you have voted, and can you please explain why?
So, as opposed to what? So we're running into coffee time, but these are great questions, so please, feel free.
Okay, let me start now with the difficult question that wants to know what my position would have been. And maybe the question now is not a hypothetical question, it's a question as to how I responded to the issue of the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes. It's a difficult question. I mean, I was at UCT. I work at UCT, and I witnessed those activities in 2015. Now, my first reaction is how I responded to a call by students to give a talk on Rhodes Must Fall, which happened about a week or two after the statue was, where Puno was posted on the side. It had not been removed then. And that talk is on YouTube, if you are modern enough not to know how it is. And you can see what my views are. But basically, what I was saying there was that this is an important, or then it was an important moment, and it's still an important moment. But we should think about ourselves as academics, and what our role as academics would be. And the role that I emphasized among students was that, look, yes, these are research questions that you are introducing, and as research questions, they need to be researched. We need to do more work to bring clarity and so on that would put at the disposal of wider society, right? The removal of roads in that particular point and so on, I read the mood and I understood the reasoning, the emotional responses and the arguments that were put, and I was not against the removal of that statue. I was there, saw it being lifted. It didn't fall. It was lifted and put on the back of a truck and put elsewhere. But I would have been, against the destruction of the statue, because by destroying it, we are destroying our history. And I would be against an idea that says that nothing should be said about where Rhodes was. I think there should be a way of preserving that space and acknowledging it, that this is where an arch-imperialist statue was, and this is what happened to the Seattle. It's no longer there, and so on. So I hope that position is clear. It's about destroying and what that means to our history. If you destroy to erase something that happened from history, I think that's criminal, especially for us as academics. And shocked by the events of 2016? Yes, I was shocked because I didn't expect that to happen. What actually happened there was that I was in Mozambique at the Center for African Studies in Mozambique. And there was a discussion, it was the 40th anniversary of setting up the Center for African Studies in Mozambique. And on the day, that 7th of March 2016, I was still there, and I decided to leave that conference to be part of the first commemoration of the Rhodes Must Fall event. So I arrived there in the afternoon. I had no idea of what arrangements had been made, and on that evening, as the director of the Center for African Studies, I was asked to give the opening remarks. And as I was talking, I saw a group of people, naked and so on, coming to me. I couldn't work out what was happening. The next thing, the mic, it was not grabbed. I was not holding the mic as I'm doing now. It was there, so they took the mic and took over the event. So that surprised me. But I think what's important was how I responded. And my first response, especially when my colleagues and some other people asked me to call the police, the security and so on, was that no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to address this. I'm going to talk to the people and try and understand what's happening and and how we can resolve the issue. That was the first move, and I did that almost single-handedly. No one wanted to touch that moment, but I was there. And I remember there was an exhibition that evening, and we are outside. So when the mic was grabbed from me, the protesters went inside the gallery. And when I followed them, I found them lying on their backs. And so those were, but despite that, I tried to engage with them, and we managed to resolve the issue. When they told me that I must give them space, leave them, they are going to leave when they had resolved their issues, I said to my colleagues, let's follow that. We did that, nothing was broken, except that the exhibition was damaged. because they protested against that exhibition. So yes, I was shocked, but I knew almost instinctively how to deal with those matters. I couldn't use the tactics that were used by a regime that I so hated, right? I had to use no other means, and I'm happy that seemed to work. And just briefly, what is the other question? And the issue of race. I mean, in my work, I look at race and racism. So there's the issue of race, and then there's the ideology of race, racism. And racism, I understand, and I'm not here alone in this company. I understand as a system that is used to exclude others, right? So we cannot do much about the biological factor, that I'm black, you're white, and so on. But what we must fight hard is the ideology that emanates from that. The ideology that tries to suggest that if you are white, you are better off than others. That if you are white, almost there were suggestions in the 30s that some of these differences were biological. In fact, Crane Sodin, South Africa, writes about the Cape radicals, and he traces this debate about racism in the Western Cape in particular, back to the 1930s. And it's inspiring to learn that there were people then who were making this distinction between race and racism. Racism, I'm against. You must fight it, all of us, whether you are black or white. But the issue of racism, we must educate ourselves to understand that racism is not a biological issue. You are not superior simply because you are white and so on. And in this debate, as I said, it's an open debate. No one should be excluded, but the rules of the game must be respected. I think, these are the major questions, I have something to say now about, the issue of Tanzania. The only thing I want to say about those debates and what later happened in South Africa is also the question of racism. That, yes, there were what one would call white, radicals and so on. But it's also interesting to note how those white radicals excluded blacks. And I'm reminded here of the South African example of how Mafege's work was excluded, was marginalized in a debate on the articulations of modes of production in South Africa, where people like Mike Morris and Harold Wilpe, made arguments that Mafege contested, published the contestation in a journal that we all read, Journal of Southern African Studies, not a marginal journal, published in a dark corner in Africa and so on. Mafege responded, took their arguments seriously, but it's surprising that none of the two thought it important to respond to Mafege.
I think you need coffee, isn't
I
it?
you can have a brief response, but
one
yes.
final remark.
Yes, precisely.
What you noticed in Tanzania, I noticed in Zambia, and I noticed in Kenya. So at some point, there was a plural community of rather radical scholars who were really building up fantastic research institutes. IDS Nairobi is one, the University of Dar es Salaam had another one, Lusaka had another one. And what we need, I think, is genuine historical study about what has happened there and find out what killed those institutes or made them, in fact, harmless for the powers that be. And I would also plea for sociology of science studies about area studies. My example of Pokot, so look at the harvest of 100 years of scholarly work and do a genuine analysis of what it meant that those people did those studies in those periods, and in fact without a lot of involvement from, say, local knowledge builders, let alone from oral history. So that type of study, it's detached from ideology, It's a genuine study of the sociology of science, or the philosophy of science, and I hardly see it happen. I think we really need that. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you both for getting us off at a great start here. 20 minutes, and then we'll be back.